Year 1851. Crystal Palace, a quickly constructed building, completely disappeared. In the middle of a public park, a building appeared that did not seem to belong to its century. It rose not as stone normally rises, layer by layer, season after season, but as a single continuous gesture, a vast enclosure of glass and metal stretching across open ground as if the space itself had been measured, folded, and sealed in one motion. Sunlight passed through its walls without resistance. Trees stood inside it as calmly as they had stood outside before its arrival. From a distance, the structure looked less like architecture and more like a condition imposed briefly upon the landscape, transparent, regular, and precise. This was the Crystal Palace, erected in 1851, and from the moment it stood complete, it introduced a quiet imbalance. Not because it was ornate or monumental in the traditional sense, but because its scale and speed did not align easily with what is usually associated with 19th century construction. The building covered an area larger than many permanent civic structures of its time. Its roof spanned distances that normally demanded heavy masonry and massive supports, yet here the load appeared to dissolve into a framework so light that it seemed provisional, almost reversible, as if the entire building could be unmade as easily as it had been assembled. Contemporary accounts describe the process as efficient, rational, and orderly. Components arrived in sequence, panels were fitted into place, the structure grew according to plan, not improvisation. There were no long pauses waiting for stone to cure or walls to settle. Instead, progress advanced with a regularity more commonly associated with manufacturing than with architecture. To observers, the speed was impressive but not dramatized. It was reported, recorded, and then accepted as a fact of execution. And yet, when the building is considered in full, that speed remains difficult to situate. The Crystal Palace was not a small pavilion or a temporary shed. It was a vast, enclosed volume, capable of housing entire exhibitions, crowds of visitors, machinery, and displays from across the industrial world. It had to stand safely, accommodate movement, resist wind, and remain stable through changing weather. These requirements were met not by mass, but by precision. The structure relied on repetition, uniformity, and alignment, qualities that reduced material weight while increasing overall coherence. The building's transparency amplified the effect. There was no facade to conceal complexity. Everything that held the structure together was visible. Columns were slender, connections were regular. The building did not hide its method, yet the method itself was rarely discussed in detail. It was seen, photographed, admired, and then folded into the larger story of progress, invention, and exhibition. What makes the Crystal Palace unsettling is not that it existed, but that it existed so completely and then did not remain. After serving its purpose, it was dismantled. The materials were removed. The site returned to open ground. Within a short span of time, one of the largest structures of its era vanished almost entirely from the physical landscape, surviving mainly in images, descriptions, and memory. This sequence, rapid construction followed by total disappearance, creates a subtle dissonance. Buildings of such scale are usually expected to leave traces, foundations, fragments, or at least prolonged presence. Here, the absence is as striking as the appearance. The structure came into being, performed its function, and was then erased from the surface with remarkable completeness. The question that emerges does not demand speculation or disbelief. It does not require the rejection of historical records or the introduction of hidden forces. It is quieter than that. It rests simply on alignment. What set of conditions, organizational, technical, and material, allowed a structure of this scale and refinement to be assembled so quickly in 1851, and then to be removed so thoroughly, leaving behind little more than documentation and an uneasy sense that the pace and capability involved do not fit comfortably into the simplified image of the age that produced it. The official story of the Great Exhibition of 1851 begins firmly within the established narrative of the Industrial Revolution. Britain, by the middle of the 19th century, stood at the center of global manufacturing, trade, and technological development. Steam power had transformed production. Railways connected cities and ports. Factories multiplied, and goods flowed outward from the British Isles to markets across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. The exhibition was conceived as a public demonstration of this position, a carefully organized display of industrial achievement intended to celebrate progress, innovation, and national confidence. The Great Exhibition was designed to be international in scope and instructional in tone. Its stated purpose was to gather products, machines, and inventions from across the world and present them in a single, comprehensible space. Nations would contribute exhibits representing their industrial capacity. Visitors would observe, compare, and learn. The event was framed as peaceful competition, progress without conflict, advancement made visible through objects rather than conquest. It was also an assertion of leadership. Britain would host, organize, and contain the world's industry within a structure built expressly for that purpose. To achieve this, a building unlike any permanent civic structure was proposed. The site selected was Hyde Park, a public green space in London that imposed immediate constraints. Any construction would need to respect the temporary nature of the event and the expectation that the park would eventually be restored. This requirement shaped the decision to pursue a structure that was not only large, but removable. Stone and brick, associated with permanence and slow construction, were ill-suited to this aim. Instead, attention turned to materials already central to industrial production: iron and glass. The design that emerged is commonly attributed to Joseph Paxton, a figure whose background lay not in monumental architecture but in engineering and greenhouse construction. His experience with large-span glass structures for botanical use informed the proposal. The concept emphasized repetition, modularity, and standardized components. Rather than designing a building as a singular form, the structure was conceived as a system composed of many identical parts, each fabricated off-site and assembled according to a fixed plan. Once approved, the project moved rapidly into execution. Manufacturers were contracted to produce iron columns, beams, and glass panes in large quantities. Dimensions were standardized to simplify production and assembly. Transportation networks, already developed through rail and canal systems, were used to deliver components to London on a predictable schedule. On site, teams worked in coordinated sequences, erecting the framework and installing glass panels with minimal interruption. According to contemporary records, construction began in earnest in late 1850 and progressed steadily through the winter months. The process was closely monitored and documented. There were challenges, but no fundamental delays. By the spring of 1851, the building stood complete, enclosing a vast interior space capable of accommodating thousands of exhibits and visitors. The Crystal Palace opened in time for the exhibition's commencement, fulfilling its role exactly as intended. Within this official account, the project appears as a logical extension of industrial capability. Britain possessed the materials, the labour force, and the organisational capacity to execute such a structure. The building's form followed its function. Its temporary nature justified its unconventional appearance. Its success reinforced confidence in industrial methods and validated the exhibition's purpose. Yet when the timeline of construction is placed alongside the broader context of 19th century building practices, a subtle tension emerges. The period between design approval and completion was remarkably short for a structure of such size. Comparable civic projects of the era, built in stone or brick, often required many years from conception to completion. Even with simpler designs, the processes of quarrying, transporting, and assembling traditional materials imposed limits on speed. The Crystal Palace operated under different constraints, but it also confronted challenges of scale. The quantity of iron and glass required was immense. The coordination of multiple manufacturers, transport systems, and on-site labor demanded precision. Errors in standardization could have halted progress. Weather conditions posed risks, particularly during winter assembly. Despite these factors, the project maintained momentum. This efficiency invites comparison rather than contradiction. The exhibition building was not unique in its use of industrial materials, but it was exceptional in the degree to which those materials were deployed as a complete architectural system. It treated construction as an exercise in logistics and assembly rather than craftsmanship alone. In doing so, it approached the limits of what contemporary infrastructure could support. The question that arises is not whether the building could be constructed in this way, but how the necessary coordination was achieved so seamlessly within the available technological framework. Railways, factories, and skilled labour existed, but they were still relatively recent developments. Integrating them into a single project at this scale required organizational discipline that is often associated with later industrial practices. Placed against other large projects of the period, the Crystal Palace stands apart in tempo. Bridges, stations, and public buildings advanced incrementally, constrained by materials and methods. Here, the pace was compressed, the sequence tightened. The result was a structure that appeared suddenly, complete, and functional, embodying industrial logic with unusual clarity. The official narrative accommodates this by emphasizing planning, innovation, and national capacity. It presents the speed as an achievement, a demonstration of progress. What it does not elaborate on in depth are the operational details that made such speed routine rather than exceptional. The exhibition proceeded. The building served its purpose, and the question remains quietly in place, suspended between acknowledgement and analysis. How exactly was this tempo organized, and where did its practical limits truly lie? The materials that defined the Crystal Palace were not new in isolation, but their use at this scale and in this combination placed them in unfamiliar territory for the mid-19th century. Glass had long been present in architecture as windows, lanterns, and conservatory panels, yet it was usually limited by size, cost, and inconsistency. Producing large sheets required careful control of temperature and technique, and variations in thickness or clarity were common. In most buildings, glass remained subordinate to masonry, inserted into walls rather than forming them. In the case of the exhibition building, that relationship was reversed. Glass became the dominant surface, not decorative but structural in function, responsible for enclosing space across vast spans without interruption. To achieve this, production had to move beyond artisanal output. Thousands of panes were required, each matching precise dimensions to fit standardized frames. This demanded a level of uniformity that challenged the limits of contemporary glassmaking. Furnaces had to operate continuously. Processes had to be stabilized. Breakage during transport and installation had to be minimized. The panes themselves needed sufficient strength to withstand wind loads and thermal variation while remaining thin enough to reduce overall weight. None of these requirements were extraordinary on their own, but together they formed a set of constraints that pushed production toward an industrial mode rather than a craft-based one. Iron, used for the building's frame, occupied a similar position. Cast and wrought iron were already integral to bridges, railings, and machinery. Their properties were well understood: high compressive strength, predictable behavior under load, and the ability to be shaped in foundries according to specification. What distinguished the Crystal Palace was not the novelty of iron, but its systematic deployment as the primary skeletal element of an entire building. Columns, beams, and connectors followed repeatable profiles. Loads were distributed through slender members rather than thick walls. The frame did not conceal itself behind stone, it defined the building's form openly. When compared to traditional masonry, this approach altered fundamental assumptions. Stone and brick rely on mass and compression. They require time for assembly and settlement. Each wall is built in place, its dimensions adjusted as construction progresses. Iron and glass, by contrast, demand precision before assembly. Components must fit correctly the first time. Errors propagate quickly through a modular system. This shifts labor from the site to the workshop, from adaptation to adherence. The physical requirements of such a system include accurate measurement, controlled fabrication, and reliable transport. The combination of glass and iron also imposed new structural considerations. Transparency removed the possibility of hiding reinforcements. Every joint and connection was visible. Structural integrity could not be disguised by thickness. Stability had to be inherent in the geometry of the frame. This required careful calculation of spacing, load paths, and tolerances, even if those calculations were not formally recorded in the way modern engineering would demand. The building's survival through its operational period indicates that these requirements were met consistently across its immense footprint. The assembly of these materials transformed construction into an exercise in coordination. The building was designed as a collection of modules, each defined by a fixed bay dimension. Columns repeated at regular intervals. Beams connected them in predictable patterns. Glass panes filled the resulting grids. This modularity allowed parts to be manufactured simultaneously in different locations, then brought together on site. Assembly became a matter of sequencing rather than invention. of placing known elements into predetermined positions. This method stands in contrast to traditional building practices of the era, where each project developed its own idiosyncrasies. Masonry structures adapted to local materials, site conditions, and craftsmanship. Variations were expected and accommodated. The Crystal Palace, by necessity, minimized variation. Its success depended on sameness. Identical components reduced complexity and increased speed. Workers did not need to interpret unique details at every stage. They repeated the same actions across the site. In this sense, the structure resembled an early industrial system more than a conventional building. It shared characteristics with manufacturing processes that were emerging in factories: standardized parts, division of labor, and repetitive tasks. Yet construction itself was not yet fully industrialized. Tools were simple, power assistance was limited. Much of the work relied on human coordination and physical effort. The achievement lay in aligning these human capabilities with a design that demanded consistency rather than improvisation. What emerges from examining materials and assembly together is not a contradiction, but a threshold. The Crystal Palace occupied a transitional moment where industrial logic entered architecture decisively, even if the supporting practices were still evolving. Glass and iron, used in this way, required the project to function as a system rather than a collection of individual acts. The building did not innovate materials so much as it reorganized how they were produced, combined, and deployed. This reorganization helps explain both the speed of construction and the ease of dismantling that followed. A system designed for assembly can also be reversed. Components can be removed, transported, and reused. The building's disappearance was not a failure of permanence, but a consequence of its logic. Its materials and methods were optimized for process, not longevity. And in that optimization lies the quiet tension that continues to surround it, a reminder that the industrial approach to building arrived not gradually, but suddenly, fully formed, and then moved on. The Crystal Palace did not function merely as an enclosure for objects. It operated as a coordinated system whose performance depended on continuous regulation. Once open to the public, the building had to manage the movement of thousands of visitors each day without congestion or confusion. Its interior volume was organized along long, uninterrupted aisles that allowed people to circulate smoothly, distributing crowds across the length of the structure rather than compressing them at narrow points. Entrances and exits were positioned to balance flow, reducing the accumulation of bodies at any single threshold. The building's geometry encouraged motion, guiding visitors forward through repetition and scale rather than signage alone. Air movement was equally critical. Enclosing such a vast space beneath glass introduced the risk of stagnation and heat buildup. The structure addressed this through height and permeability. Warm air could rise into the upper reaches of the roof, while cooler air entered from lower openings, creating a natural circulation pattern. Ventilation was not hidden within ducts, but integrated into the form of the building itself. Openings along the roofline and at the base allowed air exchange to occur continuously, moderated by the building's sheer volume. The effect was not precision climate control in a modern sense, but a passive system capable of maintaining tolerable conditions under varying occupancy. Light defined the interior experience. The extensive use of glass transformed daylight into the primary source of illumination, eliminating the need for artificial lighting during operating hours. This reduced heat from lamps and allowed exhibits to be viewed in consistent conditions throughout the day. The uniformity of light also reduced visual fatigue, an important consideration for visitors spending hours inside. The structure did not direct light towards specific focal points. Instead, it created an evenly lit environment where objects could be examined without dramatic contrast. This neutrality supported the exhibition's educational purpose, presenting artifacts without theatrical emphasis. Temperature control emerged as a consequence of these combined systems. Glass admitted solar heat, while ventilation mitigated its accumulation. The building's height and openness moderated extremes, preventing rapid temperature swings. While conditions undoubtedly varied with weather and crowd density, the overall performance remained within acceptable limits for the duration of the exhibition. This balance was achieved without mechanical intervention, relying instead on the interaction between material properties, geometry, and natural forces. Operating such a building required constant attention. Panels had to be inspected for breakage. Structural connections needed monitoring under dynamic loads caused by wind and movement. Maintenance teams addressed issues as they arose, ensuring continuity rather than perfection. The absence of recorded failures suggests that the operational demands were understood well enough to be managed effectively, even if formal documentation of these procedures is limited. This operational success underscores a broader point. The Crystal Palace functioned less like a static monument and more like an instrument. Its performance depended on alignment between design, intent, and daily use. It responded to environmental inputs and human presence in predictable ways. The building did not merely exist, it worked. Its ability to host vast crowds over an extended period without systemic breakdown indicates that its designers anticipated not only how it would be assembled, but how it would behave once occupied. When attention shifts from what the building did to what remains recorded about how it did it, a different pattern emerges. The historical record preserves descriptions of the completed structure, accounts of its opening, and commentary on its impact. What it does not consistently preserve are detailed explanations of the processes that sustained it. There is no comprehensive description of industrial workflows behind component production, no unified account of quality control measures, and no formal analysis of long-term structural risk prepared during its design phase. This absence does not imply negligence. Documentation standards differed, and much operational knowledge was held in practice rather than in writing. Decisions were made by engineers, foremen, and managers who relied on experience as much as on calculation. The building's temporary status may also have reduced the perceived need for exhaustive archival records. A structure intended to stand for a limited period did not invite the same scrutiny as one meant to endure for centuries. What is recorded, however, is outcome. The building was completed. It functioned as intended. It accommodated visitors and exhibits safely. It was dismantled in an orderly manner once its role concluded. These facts form a continuous sequence that suggests competence without revealing method in full. The absence lies not in results, but in the intermediate layers of explanation that connect intention to execution. There is no surviving body of documentation that traces each step of the industrial process from raw material to finished component in a single narrative. Risk assessments, if conducted, are not preserved in a systematic way. Design tolerances and contingency plans are not laid out in the language familiar to modern engineering. Instead, the record consists of fragments, contracts, illustrations, reports, and recollections that confirm existence without detailing process. This pattern aligns with the building's logic. A system optimized for speed and reversibility does not prioritize long-term documentation. Knowledge is distributed across participants rather than centralized in archives. Once the project ends, that knowledge disperses with the workforce. The structure's removal marks not only the end of its physical presence, but the dissolution of the organizational framework that sustained it. What remains is a completed arc. The Crystal Palace stands, operates, and disappears, leaving behind sufficient evidence to confirm each stage, but not enough to reconstruct every decision that enabled them. The absence is not dramatic, it is procedural. Certain questions were never asked in ways that demanded preservation, and so their answers were never fixed in record. This is where the building's significance deepens. It demonstrates that large-scale, system-based construction could be executed successfully before the emergence of modern documentation practices. It shows that coordination and performance can precede formalization, and it leaves a space between what is known and what is explained, a space defined not by mystery, but by the limits of what was considered necessary to record. The Crystal Palace operated like a machine, and like many machines of its era, it was understood through use rather than through exhaustive description. Its success is visible, its methods are inferred, and between those two facts lies a silence that invites attention without compelling conclusion. When the Great Exhibition closed its doors, the building that had made it possible entered a different phase of its existence, one defined not by admiration but by administration. The crowds dispersed, exhibits were removed. The vast interior that had once contained the compressed image of the industrial world fell quiet. What remained was a structure whose purpose had been fulfilled. From the beginning, it had been framed as temporary, a solution designed for a moment rather than for continuity. This framing would soon guide the decisions that followed. Official discussions turned quickly to practical considerations. Maintaining such a large structure demanded resources. Glass panels required inspection and replacement. iron elements needed protection from corrosion. Staffing and security costs would continue indefinitely if the building were to remain. The land it occupied, a public park, carried its own value and expectations. Restoring the landscape was part of the original agreement. The building's presence, once justified by the exhibition, now stood in tension with those commitments. Cost featured prominently in these deliberations. The exhibition had been expensive, and while it was successful, its surplus was not unlimited. Preserving the structure would require additional investment without a clearly defined return. Unlike museums or civic buildings with ongoing functions, this structure had been tailored to a specific event. Repurposing it would involve adaptation, and adaptation implied further expense. In a period attentive to fiscal responsibility, the simplest option was removal. There was also the question of intent. The building had never been presented as a permanent monument. Its design emphasized assembly and disassembly. Components could be taken apart, transported, and reused. This characteristic, celebrated during construction, now facilitated dismantling. The process unfolded methodically. Panels were removed, frames were separated. The structure came down without drama, its disappearance mirroring the efficiency of its creation. When compared to other emblematic buildings of the era, the contrast is striking. Stone institutions erected to embody authority or memory were preserved and maintained, even at high cost. Their permanence justified investment. The exhibition building, by contrast, embodied a different value system. It represented process rather than endurance, capability rather than legacy. Once its demonstration was complete, its continued presence was not considered essential. This outcome aligns with the logic that produced the structure in the first place. A system optimized for speed and function does not necessarily prioritize longevity. The same principles that allowed rapid assembly also allowed clean removal. The building did not resist its own dismantling. It complied with it. Its disappearance was not a failure, but a completion of purpose. Yet the absence it left behind feels disproportionate to the magnitude of what had stood there. One of the largest enclosed spaces of its time vanished from the landscape, leaving behind only documentation and recollection. There is no ruin to visit, no gradual decay to trace. The building exited history almost as efficiently as it entered it. This efficiency contributes to why questions about it are rarely sustained. Historical narratives tend to privilege what remains visible. Structures that endure become reference points. Those that disappear entirely are more easily absorbed into the background of events. The Crystal Palace is remembered as an episode rather than as a persistent presence, a chapter rather than a foundation. The way history frames the 19th century reinforces this tendency. Accounts emphasize milestones, exhibitions, inventions, and national achievements. The building is cited as a symbol of industrial confidence, then set aside. Attention shifts to what followed rather than to how it was achieved. The mechanics of construction, coordination, and operation become secondary to the symbolic outcome. This narrative preference shapes the kinds of questions that are asked. It favors what happened over how it worked. It celebrates progress as a sequence of events rather than as a series of processes. In doing so, it smooths over the operational complexities that made such progress possible. The Crystal Palace fits neatly into this pattern. It is acknowledged as impressive, then allowed to dissolve into the broader story of advancement. As a result, inquiries into the building's logistical and organizational underpinnings remain limited. They are not absent, but they are peripheral. The focus remains on the exhibition's impact rather than on the systems that supported it. This is not an oversight so much as a reflection of historical habit. Narratives select what reinforces coherence and leave aside what complicates it. The disappearance of the building thus mirrors the disappearance of detailed attention to its methods. Both are consequences of a perspective that values outcomes over infrastructure. The structure served its role in demonstrating industrial capacity, then stepped out of view. The city moved on. The park returned to openness. The absence became normal. What lingers is not a sense of loss, but a quiet gap. A recognition that something of great scale and sophistication existed briefly, operated successfully, and then left little trace beyond records. The decision not to preserve it was rational within its context. The lack of sustained questioning is consistent with how history often functions. And yet, beneath the accepted explanations, a simple curiosity persists. Not about hidden motives or forgotten powers, but about emphasis. about why some achievements are examined in detail while others are summarized and released. The Crystal Palace was dismantled because it was designed to be. The questions surrounding it were not pursued because they were not necessary to sustain the narrative of progress. The building no longer stands. The event has concluded. What remains is an outline, clear enough to confirm that it happened, incomplete enough to invite reflection. And in that space between certainty and detail, the story pauses, not to demand answers, but to ask how many other processes have passed into history fully executed, briefly celebrated, and then quietly set aside without ever being examined for how they were truly made possible. The building is no longer there. Where glass once stretched across open ground and iron frames traced long, repeating lines against the sky, there is now only landscape, reordered and familiar. No outline remains to suggest the scale that once occupied the space. No fragment rises from the ground to interrupt the continuity of the park. The Crystal Palace exists today only as absence, a structure remembered without being encountered. What persists instead are representations. Photographs capture its length and transparency, freezing moments when light reflected off thousands of panes. Drawings record its proportions with careful precision, grids of columns and beams translated into ink. Written descriptions recount the experience of standing inside a volume so large that it altered one's sense of enclosure. These records confirm that the building was real, that it functioned, that it mattered, yet they also underscore how completely it has been removed from physical experience. This removal shapes how the building is understood. Without ruins or foundations to revisit, the Crystal Palace becomes an idea rather than a place. It is cited in histories as an example, a symbol, a turning point. It appears briefly, does its work, and exits. The focus shifts easily from the object itself to what it represented. Industrial confidence, national pride, technological optimism. The mechanics that made it possible recede into the background. The contrast between presence and documentation creates a subtle imbalance. A structure of extraordinary size and complexity left no lasting imprint on the ground, yet it occupies a defined place in the narrative of progress. This disconnect encourages a simplified reading. The building becomes proof that the 19th century was inventive and ambitious, but not necessarily an invitation to examine the full extent of its capabilities. Without the building standing, it is easier to accept general explanations. Industrialization, innovation, and organization are invoked as sufficient causes. The details of coordination, production, and execution are assumed to fall naturally within those terms. The absence of the structure allows the absence of detailed questioning. There is nothing to walk around, nothing to touch, nothing to measure anew. The building cannot insist on further inquiry. And yet, the records remain detailed enough to provoke thought. They show a system that worked, a project that aligned materials, labor, transport, and design with unusual efficiency. A building that operated reliably and was dismantled deliberately. These facts are not in dispute. What remains open is how fully they have been integrated into our understanding of the period. The 19th century is often portrayed as a time of gradual technical maturation, moving step by step toward modernity. The Crystal Palace complicates that picture. It suggests that certain forms of organization and execution arrived suddenly, fully articulated, and were then treated as temporary demonstrations rather than as baselines. The building did not lead directly to an immediate proliferation of similar structures. Instead, it stands slightly apart, an episode that was acknowledged and then set aside. This distance invites reflection rather than resolution. The Crystal Palace does not demand reinterpretation of history. It does not overturn established accounts. It simply occupies a space where capability and narrative do not align perfectly. It hints that the technical reach of the era may have extended further and with more coherence than the simplified story suggests. The building's disappearance makes this easier to overlook. Without a physical reminder, memory relies on selection. We remember what fits comfortably within a linear story of progress. We compress complex processes into emblematic moments. The Crystal Palace becomes a milestone rather than a case study. Standing in the space where it once rose, nothing compels attention to what is missing. The ground offers no resistance to forgetting, but the documents persist, quietly preserving the outline of something that was once complete and operational and then deliberately undone. The story ends without resolution, as the building did. It leaves behind a question that does not ask for a single answer, but for reconsideration. Did we underestimate the technical and organizational capacity of the 19th century, or do we simply remember most clearly the achievements that fit neatly into a linear narrative of progress, allowing others, however remarkable, to pass into history as brief appearances rather than enduring reference points?